This video is for those who own or are about to buy a new Mac for music production but don't know which one is the best option right now. Your current machine is getting sluggish, you're at a crossroads where you're either running out of computer power with big sessions in your DAW, or you're somehow forced to upgrade to a new operating system because of regular software updates and your machine won't support it anymore. Buying a new machine is quite tricky because you don't really know when it's going to be possible to upgrade again down the road. And surely the worst mistake of all is to get something with insufficient horsepower that underperforms and be stuck with it for years to come. So in this video, we'll look at finding the most cost-effective option according to your specific needs and make sure that you have enough money to buy groceries while you're recording bands. Just looking at specs on a website will only take you so far because specs won't always translate to performance when we're talking about DAWs and music production. That's where I come in with all the experience I've gathered for you and all the time I spend doing research to try to find the best deal and save you a bunch of time. There are 5 crucial questions that you should ask yourself before even considering buying a new Mac for audio production. The first and most important one, are you sure that your current software and hardware is supported with the latest Mac operating system? Because new Macs come with the latest operating system from the box, which right now would be Mac Sonoma, but if you're buying your computer, let's say in fall 2024, you're gonna be stuck with Sequoia, which is gonna be the new OS that's gonna be released. Installing an older version of Mac OS on a new machine that's coming out from the store may be challenging or even sometimes impossible due to the fact that the computer's components are requiring this new operating system software to be able to function properly. So if you're running an older version of a DAW, let's say Pro Tools with a perpetual license, and you haven't renewed your subscription, chances are that this version won't be supported with the latest operating system. So you have extra fees regarding software on top of your fees to buy a new computer. The same goes for hardware. If you're using, for example, an older audio interface that's 8 or 10 years old and that's working perfectly fine on your current system, then you buy a new Mac that comes with the new operating system just to find out that the manufacturer is not making drivers for newer operating system. So basically, you're stuck with a piece of junk that you can do anything else with, and you need to buy something new just to be able to accommodate your upgrade here. Software also include plugin versions, so some plugin versions won't be supported with the latest operating system. So I'll put a link in the description with a hardware and software compatibility chart so that you make sure that before buying anything, you check out that list and you'll see if your current software and hardware will be supported with the latest version of Mac OS. Let me know in the comments what type of system you're using and which audio interface are you running. The second crucial thing to know before buying, are you okay with a desktop or do you need something portable? Generally speaking, you're always going to be paying much more for a laptop than a desktop because you're paying for the built-in display. But if you're buying a desktop, you can basically buy any type of screen that you can find secondhand or whatever. So if you're only doing audio, it really doesn't matter the quality of the graphics as long as the screen size is big enough so that when you're mixing, you have enough space to work around. Laptops in general have a harder time with heat dissipation, which in terms may affect performance, especially if you're working in an environment with no air conditioning. So your laptop is going to reach a certain temperature, and for the components not to fry, the computer is going to establish a certain limit of energy being consumed, which will limit your CPU power. If you're still unsure if you want a desktop or a laptop, there's always the option to buy a laptop but use it in clamshell mode, meaning if you have all the external peripherals such as an external display, keyboard and mouse, you simply make sure that you connect to a power source, you connect all the devices to your laptop, and then you close the screen and use the external keyboard, running the CPU, the engine from the laptop, but using all the external peripherals. So that way you can always take it if you need to be on the move and work somewhere else, and that way you have the conveniency of using all the external stuff from a desktop computer. Why upgradability is impossible now compared to older Mac systems, which allowed us to use our machine for more years? Well, it's the fact that Apple has integrated all these components directly on the motherboard, which is all soldered together, and supposedly it's for improved performance. power efficiency and security. But this design choice also means that RAM and internal storage cannot be upgraded after purchase. But it also means that your system will be obsolete faster, because if you're a gamer, your GPU eventually is not going to be fast enough for the newer games. Same thing for RAM if you're working with bigger and bigger sessions in your DAW. So these are things to consider when you're about to buy a new system. You have to be able to live with the system for as long as the machine's gonna last. So if you want to future-proof your system, my best advice is to make sure that you don't buy the minimal specs in terms of RAM and storage, meaning 8 gigabytes of RAM or 256 gigabytes of storage. Make sure that you buy at least 16 gigabytes of RAM and 512 gigs of storage. And the fourth advice before considering to buy a new system, maybe you found out that it's more expensive than you thought initially, or maybe you can actually optimize your current system. I actually have a full video that talks all about this right there. And the fifth advice before buying anything, if you want to buy a more expensive system and you're considering the financing options, you have to know that these changed a lot in the last years. For example, in Canada where I live right now, instead of being 0%, the options are for 7.99%. So this will also increase the baseline of your price for the system you're about to buy. And if you want to save a bit of money and you're considering using Apple trade-in program, you have to know that they will never really give you the full value of what you're about to give. So I highly recommend that you buy your new system, you make sure everything functions 100% for your studio, and then you can list your current system on Marketplace. It's also good to know that there are always options of buying certified refurbished machines on Apple's website. So for example, M1 Pro systems are still very, very powerful. So that's an option to consider if you find that the prices for M2 or M3 are too expensive. If you found value in this video so far, smash that like button and please subscribe to help the channel. And I'll be talking about the M2 and M3 systems, but you have to know that the M4 chip has already been released in the latest iPad Pro. So it may be a good idea to wait just a bit more if you're not really in a rush to buy a new system and benefit from the CPU improvement of the latest version of the chip that's coming. In fact, the latest Mac Studios and Mac Minis are running on M2 chips and maybe skipping the M3 generation to go straight to M4. So if you're looking into buying a desktop computer, it may be worth the wait. So it should be released around the end of 2024 or early 2025, desktop computers with M4 generation chips. Although it doesn't look like it's going to be revolutionary, the M4 chip offers 18% performance increase in single core benchmarks and 21% increase in power for multi-core benchmarks. So that may be a good leap between M3 and M4. The CPU, or central processing unit, is the most important part of your computer. It's the engine basically. You may think that buying the fastest M3 Max will give you the best results for music production, but that's where you may be wrong. It actually depends on which DAW you'll be using, because depending on the DAW you use, it's going to use the computer's resources differently. And why that is so crucial to understand is because even if we look at benchmarks and stats released from Apple, it doesn't mean that our DAWs, the programs that we're using to mix and record, are going to use these resources efficiently. Apple's silicon chips are very different in design than Intel's. Now the CPUs are featuring performance cores and efficiency cores, and the first one is designed for tasks requiring high processing power such as music production, video editing, and gaming, and the second one, the efficiency core, are optimized for low power tasks to conserve battery life like web browsing, emails, and things like that. And this combination allows a strong performance while maintaining energy efficiency. DAWs like Cubase and Reaper make really good use of efficiency cores in Apple Silicon chips, but it's not the same for Pro Tools and Logic at this time. Both the M2 Pro and M2 Max and M3 Pro and M3 Max should provide more than enough CPU power for audio production purposes, so it's not worth to buy an M2 Ultra, because the gain with the M Ultra chips is really geared toward the GPU, and this only benefits if you're doing a lot of 4K video editing, 3D rendering, crazy stuff that's really video heavy. So for music producers, it's really overkill, and you're gonna pay a lot of extra money for no real reason. Currently, M3 is overkill for music production, and you'll have a really hard time even maxing out an M2 Pro chip. Same thing if you're the owner of an M1 system, it's better to wait just a bit more until you see the release of the N4 system, so that way you can basically pick and choose which is the best for you. And if you choose to pick the M3, you're still gonna save because it's not gonna be as expensive as picking an M4 system at that time. Now that we've talked about the best CPU options for music production, it's really important to talk about RAM, which is the memory that's used to store data that's actively being used or processed by your computer. So the bigger your session size, the more plugins and virtual instruments you're going to be using, the more you're going to need RAM. So if you're a composer for movies, let's say, you're going to need much more RAM than if you're only recording a few instruments in a session. RAM also helps when you're multitasking. Let's say you have a big session and you also have a browser open and other applications. So if you have a higher RAM count, everything's going to be more fluid with no hiccups. The big problem with RAM now is that you can't buy aftermarket. Back then, you used to be able to buy an Apple system and just upgrade by buying a few slots of DDR RAM, stick it in your machine, and then you call it a day. But nowadays, the specs that you pick at the moment of purchase are the specs that you're going to be stuck with after down the road. So you need to be able to assess. And the best way to do that is to open your average session that you're working on right now. And to know your RAM usage, you're going to go in Activity Monitor and click on the Memory tab. And you see that your memory pressure is in green in your current system. You will not need that much more RAM in your next system. But let's say you're at 16 and you're already in the yellow, you should definitely consider checking out a 32 gigabyte system. And if you're in the red, then for sure you're gonna need much more. So I always like to play safe in this type of situation and get a little bit more than needed. I know it's expensive, but this may become the bottleneck for your system where you may be starting to have problems later down the road just because you picked a lower option for RAM. So if you're looking for an M2 or M3 system, my absolute baseline would be 16 gigabytes. I would not recommend going under that for the longevity of your system. I would say that 32 would be ideal, and if you're a composer having massive sessions, lots of virtual instruments, maybe going up to 64 would be a good idea. Regarding internal storage or SSD, never buy the highest option available on the Mac store. You're gonna be completely wasting your money away. So I would say as a general baseline, 512 gigabytes is the best pick, because if you go to the lowest option, 256, this may also become a bottleneck later down the road. If you want more than that, just buy external SSDs that you can change, that you can upgrade, and that way all your system data goes on the 512 gigabytes internal SSD, and then everything else like your session can go on the external SSDs. Regarding connectivity, like ports on your devices, if you're buying a laptop, generally speaking, you're gonna have much less ports than if you're buying a desktop. But there are always options out there like docks. So if you want to have more options for connectivity, it's almost mandatory if you're buying, for example, a MacBook Air, to have at least a USB hub. If you want to have more flexibility and bandwidth with your dock, I highly recommend that you check out Thunderbolt 4 docks. So here I have the CallDigit TS4 for $556 US. You have the Sonet Echo 20 Thunderbolt 4 Super Dock for $300 US. The Kensington AD 2010 T4 Thunderbolt 4 for $240 US. And the OWC Thunderbolt 4 dock for $224. That's the one I have right now. Now let's talk about my top picks for 2024 and why. Bear in mind my 3 important guidelines if you're about to buy a new system. First, never go under 16 gigabytes of RAM. Second, never go under 512 gigabytes of internal storage. And 3, don't go for an M Ultra processor. unless you're also doing video work along with your music production. First, the most cost-efficient laptop is the Apple M3 MacBook Air with a 15-inch display, a portable music studio. So for the specs, we have an Apple M3 CPU at 4.1 gigahertz, 16 gigs of RAM, 512 gigs of storage with 2 ports, which are Thunderbolt 4 and a headphone jack. It's very powerful. It has a great display. It's silent, light, thin, and portable. But you will need to buy an external dock if you want to have all your stuff plugged in. Now, the most cost-efficient desktop would be the Apple Mac Mini M2 Pro, a tiny powerhouse. So it's featuring an M2 Pro processor with 12-core CPU, 19-core GPU with 16 gigs of RAM, 512 gigs of storage, 4 Thunderbolt 4 ports, 2 USB-A port, Ethernet, HDMI, and a headphone jack. So you can see that here already you're gonna have more flexibility with the connectivity. The only downside is, since it's a desktop, you're gonna need to buy an external display, but that's not a big issue if you're just working with audio. Now, with the best performance laptop at a reasonable price would be the MacBook Pro M3 16-inch display with 12-core CPU, 18-core GPU with 36 gigs of RAM. So this is for power users if you have bigger session, with a solid-state drive at 512 gigabytes. You have more ports here. You have 3 Thunderbolt 4 ports, HDMI, SDXC card, and headphone jack. So you have a massive display for a laptop. And the internal fan will really help to keep performance high with good heat dissipation. It's not a feature that's available for MacBook Air. Now for the best performance desktop, which would be my top pick, the Mac Studio 2023, which is incredible power without breaking the bank. It's equipped with the M2 Max 12-core CPU and 38-core GPU with 32 gigabytes of unified memory and 512 gigabytes of solid-state drive. Great connectivity. You have 4 Thunderbolt 4 ports, 2 USB-C port, 1 SD card slot, 2 USB-A, and then 1 HDMI, Ethernet, and headphone jack. It's really a pro system, and it doesn't cost that much for all the power you have here. And then the best all-in-one budget solution, which would be a desktop, would be the Apple iMac 24-inch display. And here you have already the latest technology. You have the M3 chip with 8-core CPU and then a 10-core GPU. So the problem here is only the 8 gigabytes of unified memory. That's why I would recommend that you pick the 16 gigabyte RAM option. But if you're only getting started, you may be able to use this system for a while without any issue. And with the ports, again, it's not amazing, but it still does the job. So 2 Thunderbolt 4, 2 USB-C, and Ethernet. So that's one real good solution if you're only getting started, because basically you have a free, amazing looking display with a low cost option here. If you found value in this video, please share with your friend, smash that like button, subscribe, and see you again very soon.